My grandfather kept a jar of dried lavender on the workbench in his garage. Not decorative, not sentimental in any obvious way. He said it kept the smell of turpentine from settling into his lungs during long sessions. I used to sit on an overturned bucket beside him when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, watching his hands move across wood the way other people's hands moved across piano keys. Unhurried. Certain. Like the wood already knew what it wanted to be, and he was just listening carefully enough to hear it. He died when I was 16. 2 weeks before the funeral, he pressed a folded envelope into my hand in a hospital room and told me not to open it until I had built something with my own hands, something no one could take a claim on. He was specific about that last part. He looked at me when he said it in a way that did not include my mother in the room. I understood what he meant even then. I just did not know how long it would take to get there. My mother has run Caldwell Event Design for 22 years. If you live in the greater Nashville area and your wedding, your gala, or your corporate retreat has ever looked like something out of a magazine spread, there is a reasonable chance her company was behind it. She started with a folding table, a rental van, and a wholesale account at a flower market on the edge of town. By the time I was in high school, Caldwell Event Design had a staff of 34, a dedicated floral studio, and a reputation that meant clients booked 18 months out without blinking. She built it the way she built everything, through complete, sustained, almost punishing focus. My mother does not have hobbies. She has extensions of her professional identity. Golf, because clients play golf. Wine, because clients drink wine. She learned to speak conversationally about both with the same precision she applied to vendor contracts. My brother absorbed all of this naturally. By the time he was 20, he was already shadowing her on client walkthroughs, learning the language of logistics and margins and seasonal floral availability. He wore it comfortably, the way you wear something that was made for you. He was never told it was made for him. He just knew. I was the one who worked with wood. It started with my grandfather's garage, obviously. After he died, my mother made arrangements to clear it out. The responsible thing, she said, the practical thing. And I asked her to wait. I don't know what I thought I was going to do with a dead man's workbench and a wall of hand tools I barely knew how to use. But I sat in there for an entire Saturday afternoon and I picked up a hand plane and I ran it along the edge of a board he had left half finished. And something happened that I do not have a cleaner way to describe than this. I felt like I was still in a conversation with him. I started teaching myself. Nights, weekends, library books, early YouTube tutorials on a 7-year-old laptop. I made terrible things at first. A shelf that leaned. A small box with the lid that didn't close right. A step stool that wobbled unless you stood on it just so. I kept every piece. I kept notes in a spiral notebook about what I had done wrong and what I was going to try differently. By the time I was a senior in high school, I was making furniture. Not good furniture, not yet, but recognizable furniture. A side table with hand-cut dovetail joints that took me 11 attempts to get right. A small bench I gave my best friend for her apartment that she still has, 7 years later, in her living room in Chattanooga. I applied to a woodworking and furniture design program at a small arts college in Western North Carolina. Selective, rigorous. A 3-year program that produced graduates who went on to work with high-end studios, restoration projects, architectural firms. I applied on a Tuesday night after my mother went to bed. I did not tell her. I was accepted in March. Full merit scholarship. The department chair had reviewed the portfolio I submitted. Photographs of every piece I had made over 4 years, with written documentation of the process, the mistakes, the corrections. He sent a personal email that I read standing in the school parking lot, squinting at my phone in the afternoon glare. He said my documentation alone demonstrated a level of craft consciousness he rarely saw in applicants with twice my experience. I printed the acceptance letter at the school library. I brought it home and set it on the kitchen island on a Sunday evening, next to a small jewelry box I had spent 3 weeks making. Hand-cut hinges. A fitted interior lined with cotton velvet I bought at a fabric store on clearance. It was the best thing I had made up to that point. I wanted her to see what I was capable of. I wanted her to understand what I was choosing. She came downstairs around 8. She picked up the acceptance letter first, read it, set it down. She picked up the jewelry box, turned it over in her hands, opened the lid, closed it. Then she set it on the counter and poured herself a glass of water and told me to sit down. She told me she was proud that I had been recognized. She said it the way you say it when you mean the opposite of what comes next. Then she told me that furniture making was not a career. She used the word artisan, like it was a polite term for hobbyist. She told me that the timing was actually fortunate, because she had been planning to bring me into the business after graduation. That my brother was already handling client relations and she needed someone to run the design and production side. and that I had a good eye and that was genuinely useful in her industry. I told her I was going to North Carolina. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then she stood up and picked up the jewelry box from the counter. I thought for one specific second that she was going to keep it. Instead, she walked to the mudroom at the back of the kitchen and set it on the shelf above the coat hooks where we kept miscellaneous things that had no real home. Expired coupons, rubber bands, dead batteries waiting to be recycled. She did not throw it away. She just put it somewhere that meant it didn't count. She told me that if I wanted to go spend 3 years learning to make furniture in the mountains, that was my choice to make. She told me that the choice came with a full set of consequences. No tuition support regardless of scholarship gaps. No living expense assistance. No spot at Caldwell Event Design waiting for me when I decided to come back. No connection to the vendor network she had spent 22 years building. She said it all in the same tone she used for vendor negotiations. Not angry, not cruel, just absolutely clear about the terms. I went upstairs. I sat on the floor of my bedroom for a while. Then I took the envelope my grandfather had given me out of the back of my desk drawer where I had kept it for 2 years, and I opened it. His handwriting had gotten unsteady near the end. The note was short. He wrote that he had opened a savings account in my name at First Tennessee Bank, account number written below, and that the PIN was the street number of the address where he had grown up in Knoxville. He wrote that he'd been putting money in it since I was 12 years old, every month, because he could see what I was going to be, and he wanted to make sure I had somewhere solid to land. He told me to build things that last. The account had $18,400 in it. I sat on the floor at my bedroom for a long time after that. I did not spend the money on comfort. I was not even tempted. I understood exactly what he had given me, and I was not going to waste it on anything that didn't directly serve what I was building. The scholarship covered tuition and a small monthly stipend. I found housing in a shared rental with 3 other students, a converted farmhouse 20 minutes from campus that was drafty in October and genuinely cold by December, which everyone complained about and I privately loved because it reminded me of working in my grandfather's garage in winter. The program was harder than I expected and more clarifying than I could have anticipated. I learned things I didn't have language for yet. The structural logic of joinery, the way different species of wood respond to seasonal humidity shifts, the difference between furniture that is made to impress and furniture that is made to last, and why those two things are not always the same. I filled 3 notebooks in the first semester alone. I used my grandfather's money to buy tools. Specific, serious tools that I researched for weeks before purchasing. A quality handsaw, a set of chisels from a small manufacturer in Vermont, a shoulder plane that I still use every single day. I bought them one at a time as I had the money, and I kept the receipts in an envelope I labeled infrastructure, which is a word I borrowed from a book about small business development that a professor left in the common room. In my second year, I started making pieces outside of coursework. I rented bench time in the evenings at a shared woodworking studio in town that charged a monthly membership fee and attracted a mix of hobbyists and working craftspeople. I sold my first piece, a walnut side table with tapered legs and a small drawer, to a woman I met at the studio who asked if I ever sold my work. She paid $340. I drove home with the cash and sat in the parking lot of the farmhouse in the dark for a while. Not because $340 was significant money, which it was not, but because someone had handed it to me voluntarily in exchange for something I had made. That was a different category of thing. I filed for a business license in my 3rd year. I had been selling pieces through word of mouth and through a simple website I built myself over 2 consecutive weekends, and the sales were consistent enough that operating as a sole proprietor made sense. I named the business Ridgeline Workshop, named for the long ridge visible from the back of the farmhouse on clear mornings, and for what I wanted the work to feel like. Something that had a spine to it, something oriented. I graduated. I did not tell my mother the date. I drove back to Nashville with a rented trailer carrying my tools, a portfolio of 23 completed pieces, and a waiting list of 11 customers. The following years were not easy, and I am not going to pretend they were. I rented a workspace in a shared industrial building on the east side of Nashville, half the square footage I needed for a third of what I could almost afford. I kept Ridgeline Workshop running on the money from custom orders, which were sporadic at first and then increasingly consistent, and I kept my personal overhead at the absolute floor. I drove a truck that cost me $2,800 cash and needed a specific sequence of starter behavior to turn over in cold weather. I cooked at home. I said no to things that cost money I wasn't certain of. My brother called me twice in those years. The first time was about 18 months after I left Nashville. He told me my mother had seen a small feature about Ridgeline Workshop in a regional design publication, a 3-paragraph mention in a roundup of Tennessee makers to watch. He said she had read it, set the magazine down, and called it, and I am using his exact words, a very cute little operation. I thanked my brother for the update and went back to the piece I was working on. The second call was 2.5 years later. He didn't say much. He just asked how I was doing and whether I was planning to visit Nashville anytime soon. I said probably not in the immediate future. The call lasted 4 minutes. 8 months ago, I was contacted by the purchasing director of a hospitality group called Arrowwood Collective. Arrowwood operates 9 boutique properties, boutique in the genuine sense, not the marketing sense, along the Tennessee River corridor and into the Appalachian foothills. They're the kind of properties where the design details are understood to be the product. Their director of interiors had found Ridgeline Workshop through a client referral, had reviewed the portfolio, and had visited the workshop in person on a Thursday morning without calling ahead. She had spent 45 minutes looking at everything, asked 3 specific questions about my production timeline and material sourcing, bought a small cutting board on her way out, and left her card. 6 weeks later, I was sitting across from Arrowwood's ownership group in a conference room in Knoxville. They wanted a long-term furnishing partnership, custom pieces for all 9 properties with right of first refusal on 3 additional properties in development. The contract value over 3 years was $340,000. They wanted exclusivity on certain piece categories. They wanted the Ridgeline name on the plaques inside each property. They wanted the story. I asked for 2 weeks to review with my attorney. They gave me 2 weeks and a handshake. That evening, I was at the workshop until almost midnight, sitting at my drafting table with the contract terms open on my laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier, when my phone rang. Nashville area code. Not my brother's number. My mother does not open conversations slowly. She opened the way she opens client presentations, with the headline, clearly stated, no preamble. She told me she had heard about the Arrowwood contract. I was not surprised she had heard. Nashville's design and hospitality networks overlap significantly, and she had been in both for over 2 decades. She told me she had a proposal. Caldwell Event Design had been navigating what she called a revenue restructuring. 3 of her long-term venue partnerships had ended in the past 18 months. 2 venues had changed ownership and brought services in-house, and a third had permanently closed following a flood that gutted the ground floor. My brother was managing the operational side of the contraction, but the loss of those contracts represented close to 40% of their annual revenue base. She was, for the first time in the company's history, genuinely exposed. Her proposal was structured and efficient. She wanted Ridgeline Workshop to become a subsidiary of Caldwell Event Design. She would provide distribution access, her established vendor and venue relationships, and the Caldwell name, which still opened doors in the Nashville market and beyond. In exchange, she wanted a 51% controlling stake in Ridgeline, and the right to relocate production to a larger commercial space she would lease in Nashville. She said it made sense. She said it was practical. She said the Arrowwood contract was the kind of visibility that needed institutional support to scale properly, and Ridgeline was still a 1-person operation in a shared industrial building. She said she had watched what I built, and she respected it. She said this like it settled something. I told her I would think about it and call her back. This was not true. I already knew exactly what I was going to say. But I had learned, in the years since I left Nashville, that the most important decisions deserve at least a night of silence before you speak them out loud. Not because you're uncertain, but because you want to be sure the answer is coming from the right place in you. The next morning, I drove out to Percy Warner Park before the workshop opened. I sat on a bench at one of the overlooks for about an hour. I thought about my grandfather's handwriting on that note, the unsteady letters, the specific precision of the account number. 11 years of monthly deposits that he never once mentioned. I thought about sitting on an overturned bucket, watching his hands on the wood. I thought about the farmhouse in December, and the cold, and the 3 notebooks from first semester, and the woman who handed me $340 in a parking lot. I thought about the jewelry box sitting on the shelf in the mudroom above the coat hooks. I drove back to the workshop. I called my attorney and confirmed the contract terms with Arrowwood. Then I called my mother. I told her I was declining. I told her I understood she was dealing with a serious revenue contraction and that I did not take that lightly. I told her I genuinely hoped the business stabilized, and I meant it, because 22 years of work deserves better than an ending that comes from 3 venue contracts expiring in the same calendar year. Then I told her the truth about the rest of it. I told her that on a Sunday evening about 9 years ago, she picked up the best thing I had made up to that point in my life and put it on a shelf with the dead batteries and the expired coupons. I told her I did not say that to be cruel, and I was not saying it now to settle a score. I was saying it because it was the precise moment when I understood that what I made with my hands was not something she was going to value, and that if I stayed in her orbit, I would spend my life trying to earn a recognition that was not structured to arrive. I told her that the Ridgeline Workshop was not a cute little operation. It was not a boutique fantasy or a phase or an artisan hobby that had gotten lucky. It was a business I built from a scholarship and my grandfather's savings in 11-hour days in a cold workspace and a waiting list I built one customer at a time by making things that were worth waiting for. I told her that I was not interested in the Caldwell name. I had built my own name, and it was on the contract sitting on my drafting table, and that was sufficient. The line was quiet for longer than I expected. Then my mother said, in a voice that was not her board meeting voice, and not her vendor negotiation voice, but something quieter and slightly unfamiliar, that my grandfather had always said I was the one who would do something she couldn't predict. I told her he was right about most things. I told her I hoped she and my brother found a path through the contraction. I meant it. I said goodbye without any of the ceremony that the moment maybe deserved, and I hung up, and I sat in the workshop for a while, with the tools on the wall and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil and the Arrowwood contract open on the screen, and I felt not triumphant, which is not actually a satisfying feeling in practice, but finished. Like a joint that has finally been fitted correctly after several attempts. Clean, solid, not going anywhere. The Arrowwood partnership launched on schedule. The first property to receive Ridgeline pieces was a 12-room inn outside of Maryville, and I drove out on the morning the rooms were staged to see the pieces in context for the first time. A walnut bed frame in room 4, a set of side tables in the common area, a warm dining table in the gathering room that had taken me 6 weeks to build, and that I had nearly scrapped twice. The director of interiors walked me through each room, and I tried to be professional about it and mostly succeeded. I hired 2 people. A woman named Soren, who had been working in a cabinet shop and wanted to make furniture that wasn't kitchen cabinets, and a man named Beckett, who had a fine arts degree and hands that understood wood in a way you either have or you don't. I paid them what the work was worth. They showed up with their whole attention every single day. On my workbench, next to my grandfather's handplane, the one I've kept oiled and sharp since I took it from his garage, there is a small photograph. He is standing in the garage, probably in the mid-90s, wearing his green canvas work apron, and he is looking at something off to the left of the frame. He does not know anyone is taking his picture. His hands are at his sides, and he looks completely at ease, the way you look when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. I took the jewelry box off the mudroom shelf the last time I was in Nashville. My mother was at a client meeting. My brother was at a client meeting. My brother was in the back of the house. I picked it up and turned it over and checked the hinges and the fit of the lid, the way I always check my own work. The velvet lining had gathered a little dust. The dovetails were still tight. I put it in my bag and brought it home. It sits on my own workbench now. Next to the photograph, I put my grandfather's folded note inside it. The handwriting on the envelope is still clear, steady enough from before the end. I open it sometimes, not often, just when I need to remember that someone saw what I was going to be before I knew how to see it myself, and put $18,400 and 11 years of quiet faith behind that vision, without ever once making it a condition of his love. My grandfather built things with his hands his entire life. Furniture, mostly. Some of it is still in houses around Knoxville, and he has been dead for 13 years. That is what I am interested in. Not the recognition that comes in the moment, but the kind that outlasts the moment by several decades. The kind you have to be patient enough to earn. If you have ever been told that what you love is a hobby and not a career, that the path you are choosing is impractical, and the one in front of you is already built and waiting, I want to be honest with you about something. The path that is already built and waiting is built for someone else. It fits someone else. You will spend every year of your life in it slightly wrong, the way you spend a day in shoes that almost fit. Functional, technically, but never quite right. Build your own. It takes longer. There is no one depositing money into an account for most of you. I understand that, and I am not pretending the circumstances that helped me were anything other than fortunate. But the discipline is transferable. The documentation is transferable. The willingness to make the thing 11 times until the joint fits, that is transferable. The wood always shows you where the weakness is. You just have to look at it honestly instead of hoping no one notices. That is true of furniture. That is true of most things worth building. Keep your hands in it. I've thought about cause and effect a lot in the years since I left Nashville. Not in any abstract way, in the very specific, practical way that you think about it when you are sitting alone in a cold workspace at 11 at night, trying to figure out if the decision you made at 18 was actually correct or just stubborn. Here is what I have come to understand. The outcomes in my life, the ones that actually mattered, were not lucky. They were the direct result of choices that compounded over time in ways I could not see clearly while I was making them. When I spent 11 attempts getting a dovetail joint bright instead of moving on and hoping no one noticed, that was not perfectionism. That was a decision about what kind of person I was going to be in the work. When I bought the chisels from Vermont before I bought a comfortable mattress, that was a decision about what I was building toward. When I declined my mother's proposal and sat with the discomfort of that silence on the phone, that was a decision about what I was worth. Each one of those choices created the next one. Not magically. Just logically. The way a well-fitted joint creates a structure that holds. My mother is not a villain in this story. I want to be clear about that, because I think it is the more honest and more useful thing to say. She built something real from nothing, and that required a set of values. Efficiency, control, practicality, institutional thinking that genuinely served her for 22 years. Those values were not wrong. They were just wrong for me. The problem was never that she had a vision for her business. The problem was that she could not separate her vision from her vision for my life. Those are two different things, and confusing them cost us both something. What I learned from my grandfather, not through anything he said directly, but through watching his hands on wood for years before I understood what I was watching, is that integrity in craft and integrity in character are not separate disciplines. They are the same discipline practiced in different materials. When you cut a corner in a joint because you're tired and you think it will probably hold, you are practicing a habit of mind that will show up somewhere else in your life. And when you redo the joint because it is not right yet, even when no one would ever know the difference, you are also practicing a habit of mind. That one compounds better. Soren shows up every morning and I watch her work and I see someone who is building that habit in real time. And it is one of the better things I get to witness in a given week. Beckett has it already, naturally, in the way some people do. I hired them both because of it. You can teach technique. You cannot teach the willingness to care about the thing when no one is watching. My brother called me 3 weeks after the Arrowwood contract launched. He told me he was proud of me. It was the first time he had said that. I believed him. I told him I hoped things steadied out on his end. I meant that too. The envelope with my grandfather's note is inside the jewelry box on my workbench. I do not open it often, but I know exactly what it says, and knowing is usually enough. He saw what I was going to be before I had any evidence for it. He put $18,400 in 11 years of quiet, consistent faith behind that vision. No conditions, no stake in the outcome. Just belief, plainly expressed in the only way he knew how, through something he built himself, sustained over time with his hands. That is the only model worth following. Build something real, sustain it honestly, hand it forward when you can.